We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another webinar. I'm super excited to be here with you today. My name is Kara Oosterhuis, and I'm a field editor with Regenerative Agriculture. I'm based in southern Alberta, so I am, like I said, very excited to be here as well. A little fun fact, I am a University of Calgary Communication and Media Studies graduate, so it's extra special to be here with you today. The School of Public Policy and the Simpson Center for Food and Agricultural Policy would like to welcome you to the second event in the Simpson Center Public Education Series. So this webinar is exclusively presented by UFA and RCF, the United Farmers of Alberta, and the UFA Rural Communities Foundation. This is the second of a series of 3 webinars focused on carbon content in our soils and the concept of regenerative agriculture practices that could increase the stored amount of carbon. Today's webinar introduces the audience to regenerative ag in Canada, and it puts into the context of carbon sequestration through certain soil management practices. It poses questions like, how could the concept of regenerative agriculture be defined, measured, and integrated into GHG emissions reduction policy? Could it be implemented while adding value for the agriculture sector? Before we get into the depths of this webinar, a couple quick housekeeping items here. This will be recorded, so if you happen to have to duck out at some point, or if you know somebody who's tuning in later and they want to be able to catch the whole thing, this will be up on the School of Public Policy's website. So please be sure to go back and find the recording there, as well as I believe it will be on our YouTube page. And now, as far as Q&A goes, we will have the same sort of format as we usually do if you have tuned into previous ones. However, we are going to have a bit of a moderated discussion before we get into the Q&A. So I have a couple questions to pose our panel here, as it's important to just kind of have this discussion, I think, rather than us just giving you a bunch of slides. So we're very excited to have this conversation. And since we're live, please pose those Q&As as they come up. We'll get to them about the back half of the webinar, but if you happen to have them come up earlier, we know how it is. You can forget very easy. So please just throw them into the Q&A box here on Zoom. You'll find that in the bottom right-hand corner, and we will get those questions answered to you as well. If they are specific to any sort of panel member, please indicate as so, and I will make sure the correct panel member is able to comment. So without further ado, today's panelists are Antonious Petro, who is the Executive Director of Regeneration Canada, as well as Claudia Wagner-Riddle, who is a professor at the University of Guelph. Today's webinar is going to start with Antonious. So whenever you're ready, Antonious, take it away.
Thank you very much, Kara, and thank you, everybody. I'm really happy to be here with you today. So I'm Antonious from Regeneration Canada. Regeneration Canada is a non-for-profit that really focuses on regenerative agriculture and regenerative land management as our most promising, one of our most promising solution to the climate crisis, but also to really ensure a health and fair food systems in Canada. So we're a nationwide organization. We work on knowledge transfer, network building, and mobilization around regenerative agriculture.
And Claudia, now if you'd like to give a bit of your introduction here, we can get right to it.
Sure. So I have, so a pleasure to be here. I just I have a few kind of very short overview slides. This is not a presentation. I just wanted to start, and I know we'll be getting into this discussion, but basically soils are a big component of what regenerative agricultural practices are, like what a soil-based improvement of practices for improved soil function. And that has a number of implications for climate, carbon sequestration, water, food, of course, nutrient cycling, and so on, as depicted here in this diagram. So in my research group, we look at questions related to the impact of management on things like soil carbon storage, net greenhouse gas emissions, water budget and water quality, and then a bit more like the integration in terms of carbon footprint and economic trade-offs, obviously in collaboration with colleagues in economics. We also focus on training the next generation of scientists through this program that I lead on climate smart soils that involves 6 universities across Canada. We didn't make it all the way to Alberta, but we do have people from University of Saskatchewan collaborating. And I really like this slide here where it was our fall course where there are like 4 hands up to discuss the topic of the day. We also are very much into outreach and knowledge transfer through a soil health interpretive center that we have at the University of Guelph, shown here with field days back in the day pre-pandemic, which we hope to resume fairly soon, and an organization called Soils at Guelph that has outreach activities. So a recent one is a fun cooking with covers sort of spoof on cooking and learning how to put cover crop recipes together. So I'll leave my contact information here for you. And I'm really looking forward to having a discussion with Antonious, but also with the audience here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. So to start off here, as I said, audience, if you're watching, we will take questions, so please send them away. The question, however, I'm going to start this discussion off with is, what does regenerative agriculture mean? And does it mean the same thing to different people? So for this, I would really like you to speak to the challenges and opportunities of bringing together the different approaches or conceptualizations of what regenerative agriculture is. Do you want to elaborate? Maybe Claudia, you got something to start off with?
Well, I was actually going to ask Antonious.
Of course.
Because I'm sure, I mean, I think in Regeneration Canada, you would have a definition of what that is. So why don't you go first?
Yeah, of course. I'll start by the end. I think a good challenge that we have here in Canada with our vast territory is to come together and redefine what is regenerative agriculture in our Canadian context, taking into consideration the differences, the geoclimatic, but also the socioeconomic differences that we have among our territories and provinces. But more in general, it's really about regenerative agriculture is really about increasing the life holding capacity of an ecosystem. So instead of focusing on harm reduction, it really focuses on having a positive impact, and not only on the ecological or agronomic level, but also in the socioeconomic level. So it's a journey and it's a continuous transition. Mm-hmm. As I said, it's a specific base. It's a context and place specific principles of land management, which reverse the current trends of degradation in soil and water quality by enhancing the soil ecosystem and its biology. It's founded in world, ancestral and traditional principles from all over the world, but also backed up by modern science. And I'm sure Claudia can talk a lot about this. So the principle of regenerative agriculture aim to draw atmospheric carbon down into the soil and the above ground biomass But beyond the carbon, it also really aims to restore biodiversity, improve our water cycle, both the small and the big water cycle, and create more nutrient dense food. And beyond all of this, and I guess in the center of all of that, really to ensure economic viability of our farmers and rancher on the ground. So as you can see, defining Regen Ag for us, it's still also a journey as the process is. Mm-hmm. And one that is really necessarily, and I think we should be careful about sitting rigid and static practices that doesn't really work for in different. So we have members across the country, and southern Quebec has a total different realities in each level than southern Alberta, or more in the northern territory. And I mean, I can go forever about that, but it's the principles are the same, and the practices are very and should and must be actually context specific. So the principles we all know about, having the soil covered, increasing having roots in the soil all time, living roots. Integration of animal. I'm not here talking about only livestock, but all kind of animal to increase biodiversity both in the soil and in the above ground. Integrating more perennial culture to the rotation system. But again, that needs to be really tailored on the farm level, taking into account where are we at in our journey, what are the resources that are out there, and we can talk later about the barriers. But please, Claudia, feel free to jump in to complement that.
Yeah, so that's interesting because I don't know much about Regeneration Canada, and I thought that maybe you had a more sort of standard definition, but I think what you're bringing up is exactly what I've come across as well. I think there are actually a number of recent articles published in the refereed literature, so scientific articles that are discussing what exactly regeneration agriculture is. It's interesting that it's a concept that has been around for a long time. Like the term has been used first, I think, was like 30 years ago or so, but it has really picked up in the last 5, 6 to 10 years. And I think that has to do with the drive to actually make agriculture part of the solution, but also to some of the degradation problems that we're seeing, some of the environmental problems. And with also this focus on the importance of soil health, which is a concept that brings together a number of sort of biological, chemical, and physical factors. And we can kind of apply it to our own health in the sense of how do you know that somebody's healthy? There's a number, it's a complete package, so to speak, not just one aspect. So that is what I think what really brought it to more prominence in the last few years.
Yeah, and I really think that because it encompasses, it actually means transforming the way we grow food and the way we think about soil and about resources. And this is, I guess, the reason why coming up with a definition that fits all, it makes it really, really hard. Mm-hmm. So yes, Regeneration Canada actually will be working on a national kind of set of definitions, but most importantly, we want to make it that it always starts with understanding the context that we are operating on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, and one of the before we move on to the next question, the next sort of challenge that Kara is throwing towards us is that some of the discussion that I've read about is that, are we defining it based on practices or based on outcome, which are two very different things. And I think particularly in terms of policy setting and so on, there's kind of questions as to, or how do we measure it, right? Do we measure do we show that the outcomes are improving, or do we just accept that by doing these practices, things are improving? So, but I'll let
just to add, it's just yet another level of complexity, but that's why we're so passionate about regenerative agriculture, is that we can think about soil regeneration as the first part of this huge process, which is, how to improve the soil health and store its biology, physics, and chemistry. But then we can bring this to regenerative agriculture on the farm level. So that's, not keeping the soil at the center, but also looking at what else is happening in terms of, machineries, in terms of, really everything that's on the farm. And yet at the very end, if we're looking about regeneration as an ecosystem regeneration, that takes in like animal welfare and worker welfare, and, keeping in mind or creating a space for equity deserving communities, and looking at the food system as it's a way bigger than what we mean when we talk about sometimes about regenerative agriculture as concentrating about the soil. So are we talking about the soil, the farm, or our society that needs to be transformed in a regenerative way?
Right.
Yeah,
because one could argue that, can you actually fix the whole system by just changing one part of it, right? Like, so I think I totally agree with this bigger picture, and because a lot of things that happen on the farm are determined by how the food system works, right?
Absolutely. Those are some great comments, you guys. No worries on elaborating there. I think everyone, and I'm seeing some questions flying in, so this is great. Actually, before we get to my next question here, I'm going to throw in a question here from the audience. Question here for Claudia. Great questions about outcomes versus methods. What is the incentive for farmers to change their practices, especially if there's risk in change and a negative impact on income? Will carbon credits suffice, or does it make it more sense to approach with subsidies or some other incentive? Claudia, do you have any thoughts on that? And Antonious, of course, feel free to jump in.
Well, I think this is a good question for the whole audience and all the policymakers that are in here. But I think the person asking is raising some really important points. And I don't know if we actually have the answers to those questions, but it's about changing behavior, right? And what are the best, what is the best approach? Is it through incentives? Is it through regulation? Mostly in the agricultural sector, what has been used is incentives through cost share programs and so on. How far that will take us, is a market mechanism of carbon credits the way to go? Potentially, there are a number of issues with that. I think eventually, depending on the price of carbon, that will be something that will be worthwhile. But for now, it still costs quite a bit, the whole process of validation of the credits and so on. So far, it hasn't really taken off, right? Like Alberta has been a leader in this area of protocol development and carbon credits, and they've worked for a while, but I hear the conservation protocol was canceled, which was for no tillage, one of the practices. So I think managing risk is one of the important aspects. And I work a lot with nitrogen fertilizer, which we do have to manage better reduce greenhouse gas emissions and losses at the farm level. But that is a really difficult thing to crack in terms of how do we optimize rates without, because that's kind of like an insurance that farmers, that nitrogen application is tailored to maximizing yields. And as a producer, you don't want to jeopardize that. So how do we compensate farmers to do some of the things that are needed without them being worried about, not having a good economic return? So those are all. So I'm answering a question with more questions.
I think that this discussion absolutely warrants those kinds of things, because that's exactly, lots of these are answered with questions. Antonious, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think Claudia, put a really nice portrait on the challenges that we're facing. But I would also add that the incentives are mostly, for now, what we have are economic. But to be honest, like in 10 years from now, it's not about why we do that. It's like we will have to do it because climate change is here. We're facing. We all know what are the problems, and today we're trying to think about the solution. So we can think about this question and other more about, well, but what are the barriers to adoption? And I don't want to go into literature review, but from been working with regenerative farmers and other farmers in Canada for 5 years now, I think we can put it in 5 barriers, going from the knowledge transfer to the actual biophysical barriers in the ground, social, cultural, institutional, and economic. So when we want to respond with solution, it also needs to respond to all of these barriers at the same time. And those are huge. So we're tackling the economic, the carbon credit, I think, and this is my very humble opinion, is one small pathway, maybe the most volatile. Maybe Claudia can confirm that or not, but thinking about the carbon cycle and what would happen in the future, we really need to be careful about putting all our eggs in the same basket and counting on that. We need more in institutions, so policy, but also insurance, really big institutional change, and have this social and culture a change about looking at yield versus profit. This is also something that lots of pioneer farmers have been not counting on the yield, or not looking at the yield, but more of like input output kind of equation. So yeah, that's my 2 cents, I guess.
Thank you very much. So the next question I'm kind of melding some audience questions and some of my own personal questions here together. But one of the things I'm noticing is people are asking, how does regenerative agriculture vary from other similar approaches? So, there's things out there like permaculture, adaptive multi-paddock, grazing, organic, holistic management, et cetera, et cetera. What makes regenerative different, or is it more of the same sort of things?
I can start, unless you, Claudia, want to go, but you can please feel free to jump in. I think for us at Regeneration Canada, regenerative agriculture, what makes it really different is that it's scalable, and you can really practice regenerative ag in any type of operation, any type of farm, anywhere in the world. It just, again, when you understand the context and where we're going to go, improving soil health, improving the ecosystem, it could be tailored to any kind of farming system. And not to say that we need permaculture, we need agroecology, we need I don't want this to be like, which pathway should I take? If I don't really think everybody should talk about regen ag. I think I'd rather everybody do something that regenerate the ecosystem and the soil health for now. So whatever ideology or definition that fits you as a farmer, you should go with it. But then again, for regen ag and regeneration as a land management ideology, it encompasses all of this with the climate change, direction, and maybe a touch of while we're regenerating the land and increasing the yield, bringing back the biodiversity, we can contribute positively to the climate equation.
Yeah, I think those are all things that come to my mind as well. I think some things to still define are the relationship, particularly to organic. So originally, I think the term regenerative agriculture was used in the context of regenerative organic agriculture. And in my particular view, the use of inputs is not particularly ruled out like it is in organic systems, but the goal is to reduce inputs over time, because if you build up the soil, the idea would be systems with better soil health will rely on soil biology and nutrient cycling as opposed to requiring input fertilizers and will be in general healthier, therefore also will not need as much herbicides and fungicides and so on, although that is still, it's kind of a learning curve, right, for farmers as to how to adapt to those conditions. So that is, to me, kind of some of the things that will need to be clarified going forward, because in general, maybe it's not that important to have very fixed definitions unless you're actually getting paid to be a regenerative agriculture farmer, then it does become very important to know what exactly that means.
That's a very good point, Claudia. And I think it reminds me of how here and internally we think about this as a spectrum. And what we think about our farmers and as farms in transition. There is a spectrum from 1 to 100, and the ultimate goal is to have a regenerative farming with no synthetic fertilizer, with maybe eliminate all kind of synthetic inputs, but we also very pragmatic, and we know that it's a journey. So I think as long as you're moving from scale 1 to 2 to 3, we consider this we're in the transition journey. But I agree with you, Claudia. At some point, even if it's in a spectrum, we think of this as a scorecard versus a static, yes or no certification. At some point, we're hoping that we will have something that, let's think of it as a color-coded, where you are exactly in this journey, which makes it even more interesting and more complex process to really verify. But I think that's one way around it.
Yeah, good thoughts. Antonious, I have a question that just came in here for you. You mentioned regenerative ag is scalable. Does this mean it's cheaper when larger?
I guess we need to it's cheaper according to who, or according to what practices. I think we should not neglect, and we should emphasize that it's not only about the climate, and it's never been only about the climate. Farmer and rancher are producers, and we need to produce it. We need to feed the world. So at the end of the day, it's also about producing food in a regenerative way to feed the world. When we're talking about, broad acre farming, maybe investing in modifying a machine when we have 5,000 acre makes it theoretically, more worthy than doing the same for 300 acre. But there is also other ways of doing it for small farms than for big farms. And if per acre cost is cheaper coat to coat with broad acre farms, then when you're talking about, for example, seeds for cover crops, it's a huge amount of investment. So I don't think it's cheaper, and except for the machinery part. It's just when we're small, we need to get more creative about sharing machines, and there's lots of small local communities across the country where this machine or this extension to machinery are actually shared within the community. So when we're small, we can work together. When big, sometimes it's worth it to invest at the beginning. So again, it's not black and white answer for the questions. I guess it's really, we need the creativity when we're talking about initial investment.
Absolutely, and that's a really great way to handle that. And speaking of not black and white answers, I'm going to throw another kind of tricky one your guys' way. My apologies. So when it comes to common ground and regenerative ag, sometimes it can be a little difficult. There's lots of different values and lots of different thoughts and beliefs out there. So is there enough common ground between the different perspectives and values for this approach to be a realistic solution to reoccurring problems in modern agri-food systems? So I guess what I'm asking is the approach itself robust enough to be useful in a variety of context, scales, and systems? Claudia, maybe you want to jump in there?
Yeah, so I think, I guess it will all depend on what that definition is and how much it will encompass. But if we just step back and think about the practices that are associated with regenerative agriculture, they are already being practiced by a number of farmers at different scales, not just at a small scale. So using no-till as an example out west, where you guys are, this is, it has been, it's basically a very common practice. Cover crops in Ontario and Quebec, the percentage of cover crop use has really increased in the last few years. So I think this is also reflecting the interest of producers in improving soil health. I think there's a real sort of groundswell to not just of smaller producer organizations, but national and larger, more what we would call more commercial scale fertilizers, farmers interested in these practices. Because now the thing that I wanted to mention based on the discussion before is that to really make this broad scale adoption, there is a need for a concerted effort in terms of allowing farmers to, again, with that risk factor, to play around, to learn certain practice. So there's a big sort of learning curve that innovative farmers pursue no matter what. and other farmers are not as comfortable. So reducing some of the risk in trying out those new things that are not just intended to increase yields, but that have sort of that longer term effect. So that's the main difference in some of these practices that we're talking about, that, you know, the first year you use a cover crop, you may actually have a decrease in yield because you're still learning how to do that. But the payback comes in the longer run, and that does require a commitment and investment. So I went off tangent a little bit from Kara's question, but I think there is common ground in the recognition that soils are not there forever, that we need to care for soils. Soils are not just holding roots in place and are not just a medium to add fertilizers to that on its way to the plant, but that soils can offer us a lot more if they're cared for.
Do you have anything you'd like to add to that, Antonious?
I think Claudia answered this very well. We have enough common ground. Everybody wants their soil to be fertile and improved and living. I think we're happy now that we're talking about soil biology more than ever. There are other discussions that really needed to be just, you know, openly discussed and debated about, you know, organic versus non-organic, GMO, is that regenerative? So, but yeah, so yes, we have enough common ground to carry out a national, you know, strategy and concerted effort to improve soil health. And that brings maybe to my analogy about the soil regeneration part. We have a common ground. Now, regenerative agriculture and regenerative land management in general, we're still in the very beginning, and a lot to be cleared and discussed before we get there.
Okay, thank you very much. Another common trend I'm kind of seeing here throughout the comments is data. Everyone kind of wants to know what sort of data is out there. So what is the data around regenerative agriculture? Does the data support the claims made, or where are there gaps in the research, and how might that be addressed? Mm-hmm. Do you have any comments? Claudia, I think this is probably a good one for you.
Yeah, so I think the data is available in some cases and not in others, in some locations and not in others. Taking one example of diversification of crop rotations through, you know, use of different crops, but also use of cover crops, long-term studies in Ontario. So this is, again, like applicable for Ontario, have shown that over 30 years, a diverse rotation of corn, soybean, winter wheat with red clover as cover crop produces more stable yields over time, increased carbon in the soil. We've done some nitrous oxide work there. We don't see necessarily nitrous oxide decreasing, but it doesn't increase either. So it doesn't cancel out the carbon aspect compared to a continuous corn or a corn, soybean rotation. So there is data to support some of the claims, but not all of them, in the sense of, you know, it's a diverse country, and a lot of this research takes time because, as we were saying, it's a long-term carbon accrual that then will result in improvements in water retention and so on. So it's not, so my answer is kind of yes and no.
Yes, yes and no. Yes, and I can give some examples of, let's take no-till as an example in Western Canada. There's more studies that proves that we gain soil organic carbon in soil than there are that declines that. But then when you take the same and try to see in Quebec, for example, with the climate that is there, we see that actually it's just a matter of redistribution of carbon during in the soil horizons, and not, a net gain of carbon. But then I think there are data, if you isolate a practice in a specific, geoclimatic condition, I think we have enough data that shows that it improves soil health. But then as a regenerative agriculture, I can maybe mention this initiative from the Igdices Foundation in the States. The first attempt to really measure, to carry on a scientific study about regenerative agriculture in general. They are recruiting 1,000 farms from every state in the country. And I think in Canada, we need to start thinking about this nationally. There is lots of initiatives and studies and living lab, but again, it's 1 or 2 or 3 practices together. But if we want to have data about the regenerative agriculture in general, well, we need to, and this is maybe an impossible study to do, but we need to try it, and that takes really lots of resources, and most importantly, political and institutional will for this concerted effort across the country.
To follow up that, somebody here is asking, what does the data suggest concerning the reintroduction of trees as shelter belts and ally cropping, the agroforestry proposition? Maybe you have some thoughts on that, Antonious?
In some parts of the world, when they refer to regenerative agriculture, they actually most of the time refers to a multi-strata agroforestry system. Because if we think of it, when you have trees, shrubs, and perennial plants and some grazing on it, that's maybe the incarnation of all of this level together in regenerative agriculture. I would say in studies from Europe and other parts of the world really shows that agroforestry has maybe the maximum potential of that when it's coupled with other practices like the one I mentioned. Now, in Canada, I think we're a little bit behind in terms of agroforestry, but again, we have a very different climate, and we have big farms integrating rows of trees every 30 or 40 meters in our corn and soya and grain. It needs a total different design thinking that take into consideration what the farmer would get and what is the actual needs, and is our climate supporting this kind of production. So theoretically, agroforestry is one of the maybe most complex and impactful set of practices by itself, but it's also a very, very long term, and it really takes lots and lots of years to gain or to get the fruit of the labor by implanting trees that takes 20 to 30 years for the farmer and the soil to get the benefits that is desired from it.
Claudia, do you feel like Antonious covered that?
Yeah.
Okay. So another question coming in here is, what is the role of the different soil profiles? Would certain regions respond better to regenerative practices? And do some soil types have greater capacity for additional carbon storage? Maybe you want to start with this, Claudia?
Yeah, well, so definitely soil type is a big factor in carbon sequestration. And ironically, very degraded soils have the biggest potential because they are far off if you think about it like a bucket, that how much you can fit in, if that bucket is quite empty, then, there's more place to store the carbon. So soil types, and that's what makes it complex. So in the conservation protocol, which was the carbon credits for no tillage, in mostly used in Alberta and Saskatchewan, they had two different rates depending on the soil type, based on studies that showed different types of accumulation. So climate affects it, soils affect it as well.
Okay, so on my list of questions here, I had another one I wanted to ask you here. How do the long-term impacts of regenerative agriculture factor into the conversation? So I know we don't want to get to this point, but a lot of people have the question of, is regenerative agriculture something that we should do, or is it something that we must do? Tough one, I know.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think we need to be transparent and blunt about that. I think it's something that we must do, and this is not to keep it static. And I don't want. We have enough alarmists and whistleblower in our country, and it's all needed. I think it's very important to put things into perspective. We're not gonna solve all our crises by having 100% regenerative agriculture. I think we still are the biggest contributor of a greenhouse gas equation in Canada is still the industry and transportation, and it's not agriculture, maybe 10, 12, 15%. If we think about our food system, and I'm talking here maybe globally more, we're thinking about 30 to 35% of greenhouse gases. And this 20% beyond the farm gate comes from transportation, industry, inputs and synthetic fertilizers and storing and all of that. So not only that, we must really go into this, call it what you want, sustainable agriculture, ideally regenerative agriculture, but that need also to be done at the same time as all the other natural and non-natural climate solution that the IPCC and every scientist now talking about. So we must not stop here. I think it's a little bit oversimplified to say that this is going to save the planet. This has the potential to save our food system, but we still have another 70% of the big problem that needs different actions globally, regionally, and locally.
Yeah, if I can just bring sort of a little bit of a different perspective, because so far we've talked a lot about how agriculture or these practices can be part of the solution because they will take up carbon and store in the soil. And some recent estimates have actually shown that maybe that contribution has been quite overblown in terms of what that potential is. Not overblown, but overestimated in calculations. I think the one of the main drivers should also be, and that will bring us in the category of must do, is the adaptation to climate change. Because the climate, the weather extremes, and I don't need to talk to people out west about this with the recent droughts that they've had, that will put a big strain on the food system. So we need to work on practices that improve the soil, improve soil organic matter, in addition to other, we haven't talked about plants, but varieties and all that, but we must sort of, looking into the future, adapt to some of those swings of drought and flooding through better soil management. So that is kind of the longer term, like the short and long term view in terms of dealing with these issues.
Okay, and that is very quickly taking us to close to the end of this webinar. Before we wrap up, though, I want to ask, is there any last minute thoughts or comments, kind of closing remarks either of you would like to make?
Yeah, sure. I think it's great to have this interest from a school of public policy and agriculture, because I think this is a bigger problem than just what farmers are doing. I mean, farmers are working with what they can within the system they can, and often they may even have, there was a comment here about, it's hard to do these practices when you're barely making a profit. I like to, a farmer that I know, he usually brings this up, that it's hard to be green when you're in the red, and you may have heard that, but that's really so it is a bigger issue of the whole food system, and it's not just a lot gets piled on, this is what farmers need to do, but it is the bigger picture. So the whole ag system, food system, but also policy, right? Like how do we get to where we want to be through a mix of policy that incentivizes, perhaps regulates, but and also rewards the ones that are doing the right thing, which is often not, we only think about the majority that's not doing it, but then there's the lonely group that is doing all the right things, and because they care and they will do it anyway. But wouldn't it be nice to also reward them?
That's really well said, Claudia. I think I totally agree. And, the agricultural policy framework is coming soon. I think all the audience here, I'd invite you all to see, what's happening. There's lots of initiative of other organizations like ours that are trying to, present some recommendation to the government. And I think beyond the policy, it's become a matter of a society problem. So I think like everybody has a role to play, and sometimes just to start by understanding the problem. So I would invite you all to reach out if you have any question. Go to regenerationcanada.org if you want to get involved and know more. And yeah, thank you very much for this time. And I'm really honored to have you be on the same panel as you, Claudia. Thank you again, and thank you, Cara and Nisqual.
And Antonious, are you guys based across Canada, or where's headquarters for you?
Yes, so the headquarters is in Montreal, but we have our members and partners that are very much in every province in the Neocon. Even our team is from BC to Nova Scotia. We also have this, if I can take another 30 seconds, a year ago, we launched this interactive map of regenerative farms. You can find it on our website, regenerationcanada.org, which really locates, all the pioneers or people or farmer and rancher in transition, and you can go in each farm page and know more about their practices, their challenges, their observation, but also, if they're doing, direct sales, if they're offering internship and all of that. So please go visit. And if you know of a farm near you, you can recommend that farm. And we have our own verification processes so yeah, we're pretty much nationwide. Yeah.
That's great to hear. And now, Claudia, you guys do a ton of extension work too through the University of Guelph. How can anyone watching this maybe find some of that research?
Yeah, so they can go to soils@guelph.ca, our webpage, or my own personal webpage, and the Climate smartsoils.ca is the training program, or just send me an email. I had my email at the end of my presentation. It's easy to find because it's not a very common name. So if you Google Claudia Wagner-Riddle, you'll find me. Just send me an email.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you both for your comments and your insight. It's been a terrific discussion. I know we didn't get to all the audience Q&A, nor did we get to all of my questions because it was just, it's been a great flow and a great conversation. So thank you very much. And thanks to our audience. This wouldn't be a live presentation without you guys. So thank you very much for providing your Q&A questions. That's been really terrific. And as well, a huge shout out. We'd like to thank the UFA and the RCF for their sponsorship of the public education series. As I said, this is a 3-part series. This is number 2. So please tune in to number 3. And as I kind of said at the beginning, if you guys had to jump out or you just got in kind of the last half and you'd like to check out the full conversation, you will receive a follow-up email that has a link to the recording as well. It will be on YouTube and our public policy website, so please tune in there. As well, if you're looking for any information on upcoming webinars and the Simpson Center for Food and Agriculture Policy, you can find them at www.policyschool.ca/webinars. So thank you very much for tuning in today. As I said, my name is Kara Oosterhuis. I'm with Real Agriculture, so check that out as well. And I look forward to seeing all you guys on our next upcoming webinar.
Thank you.
Bye.